Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Let me begin with a question. When you stand up for your rights, defend your dignity, insist that no one, no matter how powerful, dictates your course, what happens? You win, you earn respect. Today we're witnessing such a drama on the world stage, a moment where one of the planet's oldest civilizations, growing in power and self-belief, faces off with the world's oldest superpower and emerges again and again not defeated, but defiant. This is the tale of why, when the United States targets India, India may suffer sanctions, threats, slurs, but in the end it loses only in the sense of being compromised, because every time India comes out stronger. Strategic autonomy has become the defining feature of India's foreign policy, especially in the 21st century. At its core, this approach means that India does not want to be confined to the orbit of any single global power, whether it is the United States, China, or Russia. Instead, India seeks to preserve its independence in decision-making, tailoring its policies to its own national interests rather than those of others. The idea is not new. Jawaharlal Nehru's policy of non-alignment during the Cold War was an early expression of this same instinct. But in today's multipolar world, it has taken on a new urgency and sharper clarity. India recognizes that a unipolar order dominated by the United States is no longer sustainable, while a bipolar world led by the US and China would risk limiting India's maneuvering space. Hence, the push for a multipolar system where India itself is one of the decisive poles of power. This pursuit of strategic autonomy is visible in how India balances its relationships. On one hand, India participates in the Quad with the United States, Japan, and Australia, projecting a shared interest in Indo-Pacific security. On the other hand, India remains an active member of BRICS, cooperating with China and Russia on issues of financial reform, global governance, and South-South solidarity. At the same time, India maintains defense ties with Russia, energy partnerships with the Middle East, technology collaborations with Europe, and trade arrangements with Southeast Asia. No single partner is indispensable, and that is by design. The result is that no country can hold India hostage by threatening to cut off ties or by demanding total loyalty. This flexibility allows New Delhi to navigate crises without being seen as anyone's client state. Strategic autonomy also explains why India resists external pressure when it comes to issues like purchasing Russian oil or defense equipment. Even as Western nations attempted to isolate Moscow after the Ukraine war, India increased its imports of discounted Russian crude. For India, energy security and affordable fuel prices for its massive population were non-negotiable. Similarly, the long-standing defense relationship with Russia, including vital equipment and spare parts, could not be suddenly abandoned to please Washington or Brussels. These moves were not about choosing Russia over the United States, but about choosing India over external demands. The message was unmistakable. India's foreign policy decisions will always be made in New Delhi, not dictated from Washington, Moscow, or Beijing. The multipolar vision embedded in India's outlook goes beyond tactical balancing. It is a statement about the future of global order. India sees itself not merely as a regional player, but as a civilizational power with global responsibilities. Its calls for reforming multilateral institutions like the United Nations Security Council, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank reflect this ambition. By arguing that the world cannot be governed by outdated structures designed after World War II, India pushes for a system that better represents the realities of today, a diverse, interconnected, multipolar world. This is why initiatives such as championing the Global South, investing in African partnerships, and providing digital public goods to developing nations have become part of India's external identity. In practice, strategic autonomy and multipolarity mean that India's power lies not in aligning unquestioningly with any one camp, but in being the swing force that others seek to court. This posture enhances its bargaining power, increases its prestige, and makes it far harder for countries like the United States to coerce it. What outsiders sometimes misinterpret as India being indecisive or contradictory is in reality a calculated policy of keeping its options open while steadily expanding its own sphere of influence. It is precisely this independence that frustrates great powers accustomed to compliance, and it is precisely why attempts to corner India so often fail. Economic interdependence between India and the United States has grown rapidly over the last 3 decades, making it one of the defining aspects of their relationship. Bilateral trade crossed over $190 billion in recent years, with both sides relying on one another for crucial sectors. India as a large and growing market for American goods, technology and services, and the US as a critical destination for Indian IT, pharmaceuticals, textiles, and skilled labor. Yet, this interdependence also reveals the limitations of American leverage. When Washington seeks to use trade as a tool of pressure, it quickly discovers that its own companies, consumers, and even political constituencies are deeply tied to India's growth story, leaving little space for heavy-handed tactics. One striking example is the US decision in 2019 to withdraw India's preferential trade status under the Generalized System of Preferences program. The move was intended to push India into making market concessions in areas such as agriculture, e-commerce, and medical devices. Instead of capitulating, India retaliated with tariffs of its own on American goods like almonds, walnuts, and apples, products that directly affected US farmers in politically sensitive states. The result was a stalemate that harmed American exporters just as much as Indian importers, forcing Washington to reconsider how much pressure it could truly apply. This demonstrated that trade wars with India are not cost-free for the United States. Furthermore, India's economy is no longer as dependent on any single partner as it was in the past. While the US remains a major trading partner, India's diversification toward the European Union, ASEAN countries, the Gulf states, and Africa has reduced Washington's ability to use economic sticks without hurting itself. The supply chain shifts accelerated by the pandemic and geopolitical tensions with China have also made India more attractive as an alternative manufacturing and technology hub. American corporations, from Apple to Google to Amazon, are investing billions in India's digital infrastructure and retail markets. This creates a paradox for US policymakers. Even as they threaten trade penalties, their own private sector is betting heavily on India's future. Another dimension is India's domestic resilience. Protective measures in sectors like agriculture, pharmaceuticals, and digital services are often criticized by the US as barriers to free trade. Yet, these policies are politically and economically central to India's development strategy. The farm sector supports hundreds of millions of livelihoods. Affordable generic drugs are vital for both domestic and global health, and digital sovereignty is becoming a pillar of national security. If Washington tries to force India into concessions that undermine these priorities, it risks hardening Indian resistance rather than softening it. The backlash would not just come from policymakers, but also from a public that sees such pressure as an attack on sovereignty. Even in disputes at the World Trade Organization, where the US frequently challenges India's subsidies or tariffs, India has shown an ability to withstand the pressure and negotiate on its own terms. The scale of its market ensures that American companies cannot afford to be locked out, giving India natural leverage. Instead of bending to unilateral demands, India often waits for mutually beneficial solutions, knowing that Washington needs access to its market as much as the reverse. This balance of dependence ensures that the US cannot treat India as it might smaller economies. It must accept India as an equal player whose consent cannot be purchased or coerced. Domestic political strength and popular consensus have become two of India's greatest shields against external pressure, particularly when it comes from the United States. India is one of the world's largest democracies, and its political leadership draws authority, not only from institutions, but also from the sheer scale of its electoral mandate. When leaders take a strong stance on sovereignty, trade, or foreign policy, they know they have millions, sometimes hundreds of millions, of citizens backing them. This legitimacy makes it extremely difficult for outside powers to bend Indian decision-making through threats or sanctions, because any concession perceived as weakness would immediately invite political backlash at home. In fact, public opinion in India often rewards defiance against foreign interference, meaning that resistance to US pressure can actually strengthen domestic leadership rather than undermine it. A vivid example of this dynamic is India's response to Western pressure over Russian energy imports. Despite repeated calls from Washington and European capitals to reduce or halt purchases of Russian oil, India stood firm. Officials argued that their duty was to secure affordable energy for Indian citizens, not to carry out the strategic preferences of other nations. Far from being punished politically, this stance was widely celebrated at home. Ordinary Indians saw it as proof that their government was prioritizing national interest above external demands. The result was not isolation but increased leverage. India bought discounted oil, kept inflation under control, and maintained strong growth even as Western economies struggled with energy shocks. The consensus across political lines was clear. No foreign actor should dictate how India manages its economic lifelines. The depth of India's democratic fabric also reinforces this resolve. Political parties, whether in power or in opposition, are acutely aware of how questions of sovereignty resonate with voters. Even when they disagree on economic or social policies, there is often broad consensus that India must not appear subservient to any foreign power. This creates a baseline of unity in foreign policy that makes sudden shifts under pressure unlikely. For instance, policies on agricultural protections, pharmaceutical exports, and digital sovereignty enjoy support across the political spectrum. US demands to dismantle or dilute these policies are not just government decisions to be negotiated. They are deeply embedded in national identity and survival strategies. National pride and historical memory also play powerful roles in shaping public consensus. India's long struggle against colonial rule has left a collective determination never to surrender autonomy again. This sentiment often surfaces whenever the US is seen as overstepping its bounds, whether through comments on India's internal affairs or attempts to dictate trade rules. Leaders tap into this well of emotion, framing resistance to US pressure not simply as policy disagreements, but as an extension of the freedom struggle. For ordinary citizens, this narrative is compelling. It transforms everyday economic decisions into questions of dignity and independence. Finally, the strength of India's democratic institutions means that external actors must contend with more than just the government of the day. Civil society, media, and state governments also play roles in shaping opinion and policy. If the US tries to exert pressure in a way that cuts against local interests, such as pushing for greater agricultural imports that could hurt farmers, protests and political mobilization can make compliance nearly impossible. This layered system of accountability, combined with a culture of resistance to foreign interference, gives India an unusually robust defense against coercion. It ensures that decisions are not just top-down decrees but reflections of a broad societal consensus, one that prizes independence over convenience. One of the recurring mistakes the United States makes in its dealings with India is misreading or underestimating what India considers its red lines. These are the boundaries of policy and principle that India will not compromise on, regardless of the diplomatic or economic costs involved. While Washington often assumes that pressure, sanctions, or incentives can push New Delhi into alignment, the reality is that such tactics usually backfire precisely because they ignore the depth of India's commitment to its own non-negotiables. When those red lines are crossed or even tested, the reaction is often defiance rather than compliance, leaving the US surprised at the resilience of Indian policy. Energy security is perhaps the most obvious example. The recent conflict in Ukraine triggered a wave of Western sanctions aimed at isolating Russia economically. American policymakers expected India, as a partner in the Indo-Pacific strategy, to fall in line. Instead, India expanded its purchases of Russian crude oil, citing affordability and national interest. This was not an act of defiance for its own sake. It was a recognition that cheap energy is vital for sustaining growth and controlling inflation in a country of 1.4 billion people. For Washington, the expectation was that diplomatic pressure and moral appeals would suffice to shift India's policy. But for India, this was a red line. No government could afford to ignore the needs of its citizens for the sake of foreign approval. The US miscalculated, and India emerged with both cheaper energy and enhanced credibility as a nation that prioritizes its people first. Defense cooperation with Russia is another area where American misreadings are common. For decades, Russia has been a principal supplier of military equipment to India. This legacy cannot be erased overnight. Attempts by Washington to pressure India into abandoning Russian defense purchases fail to appreciate the strategic dependence on existing platforms, spare parts, and joint ventures. Replacing these systems with American alternatives would take years and involve huge costs. More importantly, it would leave India vulnerable during the transition. For New Delhi, national defense is a sacred obligation. No leader can risk undermining it simply to accommodate American discomfort. When the US criticizes or sanctions Russian defense ties, it fails to understand that this is not about loyalty to Moscow but about survival and readiness in a region where China and Pakistan remain constant threats. That is a red line India will not cross. Agriculture and food security present another area where US policymakers often stumble. The American push for wider market access in India's farm sector ignores the fact that agriculture employs nearly half of India's population. Demands to dismantle subsidies or open the market fully to imports strike at the heart of rural livelihoods and social stability. No Indian government, regardless of ideology, can risk provoking millions of farmers by yielding to US pressure. Protests, political instability, and long-term damage to self-reliance would follow. Yet time and again, Washington lobbies for reforms that cross this boundary, not realizing that food security is tied as deeply to India's sovereignty as its territorial borders. Even in the digital space, the US often underestimates India's resolve. Moves toward digital sovereignty, whether through data localization laws, indigenous payment systems, or the push for cloud and software independence, are not just about economics. They are about national security in an era where information is power. When American tech giants resist these rules, or when Washington frames them as barriers to trade, they miss the point. India sees control over its digital architecture as a red line, something as fundamental as control over its borders. Any attempt to undermine that is bound to meet stiff resistance. The pattern is clear whenever the US mistakes a red line for a bargaining chip. It ends up on the losing side of the exchange. These misreadings do not weaken India, they reinforce its determination to chart its own course. Far from isolating the country, they strengthen its credibility with other partners who see India as a nation that stands firm on principle. India's resilience on the global stage is most evident in its ability to cultivate alternative alliances and partnerships that prevent it from ever being cornered by a single power, including the United States. Over the past 2 decades, India has systematically diversified its diplomatic, economic, and defense relationships, ensuring that it cannot be easily isolated or coerced. This diversification has become a shield, allowing India to navigate global turbulence while maintaining freedom of action. At the same time, it is a sign of India's rising stature. Other nations, both developed and developing, increasingly seek its partnership, which further enhances its strategic options. One clear example of this resilience is India's engagement with multiple groupings that often have competing agendas. On the one hand, it is a central player in the Quad, working with the US, Japan, and Australia to maintain stability in the Indo-Pacific. On the other, it remains a firm member of BRICS, where it collaborates with Russia, China, Brazil, and South Africa on issues of finance, technology, and multipolar governance. By participating in both, India demonstrates that it does not have to choose sides. Instead, it extracts benefits from each relationship while avoiding entrapment in any one bloc's agenda. This balancing act is not weakness, but a conscious display of diplomatic agility. Energy partnerships further illustrate India's reliance on diverse alliances. When Western powers attempted to tighten sanctions on Russia, India turned those restrictions into an opportunity by purchasing discounted crude oil, refining it, and even exporting products to other countries. Simultaneously, India deepened its long-standing ties with Middle Eastern nations like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar, securing both energy supplies and large-scale investments. These parallel relationships mean that no single country can dictate India's energy policy. It has alternatives, and it is willing to use them. Defense cooperation reflects the same logic. While the US has become a growing supplier of military equipment, India has not abandoned Russia, its traditional defense partner. Nor has it neglected European suppliers like France, which has provided advanced fighter jets and submarine technology. This mix of sources ensures that India's military modernization cannot be disrupted by a single supplier's restrictions or political whims. By keeping its procurement diversified, India maintains leverage over its partners and avoids dependence. India's resilience also stems from its growing role as a partner to the global South. Countries in Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia increasingly view India as a reliable alternative to both Western dominance and Chinese expansion. Through initiatives like vaccine diplomacy during the pandemic, investments in digital infrastructure, and development partnerships, India has cultivated goodwill that translates into diplomatic capital. When pressured by Washington, New Delhi can point to its broader global relationships to show that it is not isolated. This ability to build coalitions beyond the traditional power centers makes India harder to pressure and more influential in shaping global norms. Technology and digital sovereignty are becoming the newest frontiers of resilience. By promoting indigenous platforms such as the Unified Payments Interface, (ADAR), and data localization frameworks, India reduces dependence on foreign technology ecosystems. At the same time, partnerships with nations like Japan, South Korea, and Israel in areas such as cybersecurity, semiconductors, and innovation provide alternatives to reliance on the US tech sector. The vision of digital Swaraj is not just rhetoric, it is part of a broader strategy to make India less vulnerable to external control in one of the most critical domains of the future. Ultimately, what frustrates the United States is not simply that India resists pressure, but that it can do so without paying a crippling price. Every time Washington tries to push India into compliance, New Delhi demonstrates that it has other partners, other markets, and other sources of strength. This resilience is what enables India to act with confidence, knowing that its room for maneuver cannot be easily reduced. So here is what we must understand. The US may throw its weight around, tariffs, complaints, leverage, but what India has in its corner, self-respect, domestic strength, alternative paths, is more durable. When a lion is cornered, its roar echoes farther. When India is challenged, its resolve only becomes clearer, its alliances more diversified, its global stature more obvious. Ladies and gentlemen, don't mistake targeting for triumph. History has shown that trying to force India into compromise seldom works. India doesn't lose, unless it chooses to. And it shows time and time again that it will not. Thank you.